It was evening, a week later. My sister sat in the garden, knitting. I was walking up and down, reading. My gun leant up against the wall of the house, for I had deemed it wise to take precautions. Yet through the whole week, there had been nothing to alarm me, either by sight or sound. I was, as I have said, reading and somewhat engrossed in my book. Suddenly, I heard a crash, away in the direction of the pit. I turned and saw a tremendous column of dust rising high in the evening air. My sister had risen to her feet in fright. Telling her to stay where she was, I snatched up my gun and ran towards the pit. As I neared it, I heard a loud, rumbling sound, and up from the pit drove a fresh volume of dust. Then the noise ceased, though the dust still rose tumultuously. I reached the edge and looked down, trying to see through the reek. At first it was impossible to make anything out. Then as I stared, I saw something below to my left that moved. I looked intently towards it, and presently made out another, two dim shapes that appeared to be climbing up the side of the pit. I leant forward and peered over, and saw no more than a hideous white swine face that had risen up within a couple of yards of my feet. Below it I could make out several others. As the thing saw me, it gave an uncouth squeal, which was answered from all parts of the pit. At that, a gust of horror took me, and I discharged my gun right in its face. It disappeared with the clatter of loose earth and stones. Then I heard a quick patter of many feet, and turning, I saw a troop of these creatures coming towards me at a run. Instantly, I raised my gun and fired at the foremost, who plunged headlong with a hideous howling. Then I turned and ran. As I approached the house, I saw my sister coming towards me. She had heard the shooting. "Run!" I shouted. "Run for your life!" Without more ado, she turned and fled. As I followed, I gave a glance behind. The brutes were running on their hind legs, at times dropping on all fours. Ahead, I could see the back door. Luckily, it was open. I was some half-dozen yards behind Mary now, and my breath was sobbing in my throat. Then something touched my shoulder. I turned and saw one of those monstrous pallid faces close to mine. With a sudden effort, I swung my gun by the barrel and brought it crashing down upon the creature's head. The thing dropped with an almost human groan. Even this short delay had been nearly sufficient to bring the rest of the brutes down upon me, and I turned and ran. Reaching the house, I burst into the passage, then slammed the door, just as the first of the creatures rushed against it. My sister sat gasping in a chair. She seemed in a fainting condition, but I had no time to spend on her. I had to make sure that all the doors were fastened. Fortunately, they were. The one leading from my study to the garden was the last I checked, and I could hear something scratching on the panels. Evidently, some of the brutes were feeling with their claw hands to discover a means of ingress. That the creatures should so soon have found the door assured me that they must not be regarded by any means as mere animals. Now I bethought me of my sister, and going to the cupboard, I got out a flask of brandy. Taking it with me, I went down to the kitchen. She had fallen from the chair and was lying upon the floor. I raised her head somewhat and poured a little of the brandy between her lips. After a while, she gave several gasps and opened her eyes. And then she gave a loud scream, and scrambling to her feet, ran from the room. I was utterly puzzled and astonished. Could she be afraid of me? But why? I could only conclude that her nerves were badly shaken, and that she was temporarily unhinged. By this time, it had grown quite dark, and there came all the varied creaks and groans of which an old house is so full after nightfall. But gradually, the sounds grew on my nerves to such an extent that I decided to make the rounds of the basement again, and if anything were there, face it. Taking the kitchen lamp down from its hook, I made my way from cellar to cellar, and room to room, through pantry and coal hole, along passages and alleys that formed the basement of the old house. As I entered the buttery, I heard a movement, but the place seemed empty. I was about to leave it, convinced that I had been mistaken, when my light flashed back from two bright spots outside the window. For a few moments I stood there staring. I knew that they were eyes. Slowly I traced the shadowy outline of one of the things. It appeared to be holding onto the bars of the window. I went nearer and held the light higher. There was no need to be afraid of the creature. The window bars were strong. Yet I felt a horrible sensation of fear. I realized dimly that the creature's eyes were looking into mine with a steady, compelling stare. I tried to turn away, but could not. I seemed now to see the window through a mist. My head began to swim and throb violently. Then I was aware of a feeling of pain in my left hand. With a tremendous effort, I glanced down. I realized then that I had, in my agitation, unconsciously caught hold of the hot lamp glass and burnt my hand. I looked up to the window again. The misty appearance had gone, and now I saw that it was crowded with dozens of bestial faces. With a sudden rage, I raised the lamp and hurled it at the window. It struck the glass, smashing a pane, and passed between two of the bars into the garden, scattering burning oil as it went. I heard several loud cries of pain, and the creatures disappeared. Pulling myself together, I groped for the door and made my way upstairs. Reaching my study, I lit the candles. Then I crossed the room to the rifle stand. I selected a heavy rifle and ammunition, and then made my way up into one of the small towers with which the house is crowned. In the darkness, the gardens presented a blur of shadows. I sat still and listened. Only an occasional grunt or squeal came up to me. Eventually the moon's light rose over the trees, and I could view the gardens below. Even then, I could see none of the brutes. Until, happening to crane forward, I saw several of them lying up against the side of the house. What they were doing I could not make out, but taking aim, I fired at the one directly beneath. There was a shrill scream, and as the smoke cleared, I saw that it was lying on its back. The others had disappeared. Immediately after this, there came a long squeal from the pit. At once, the garden was filled with answering cries. As I looked over the parapet, it seemed as though the shrubberies were alive. They tossed hither and thither, while a continuous noise of scampering feet rose up to me. Several times I saw the moonlight gleam on running white figures among the bushes, and twice I fired. The second time, my shot was answered by a squeal of pain. A minute later, the gardens lay quiet. From the pit came the babel of swine talk. At times, angry cries smote the air. It occurred to me that they were holding some kind of council of war. I decided that now would be a good time to make a final survey of our defences. This I proceeded to do at once, examining each of the solid oak doors in the basement. Then I went upstairs to the study. I was more anxious about this door, that opens onto a raised lawn at the side of the house. It is of more modern make than the others, and is of lighter construction. I spent some time puzzling how to strengthen it. Finally, I went to the kitchen and brought up several heavy pieces of timber. These I wedged slantwise against the door, nailing them top and bottom. For half an hour I worked hard, and at last got it shored to my satisfaction. Then, feeling easier, I proceeded to attend to one or two matters before returning to the tower. It was whilst thus employed that I heard a fumbling at the door, and the latch was tried. Keeping silence, I waited. I heard the creatures grunting to one another softly. Then suddenly there was a quick, low grunt, and the door creaked under a tremendous pressure. It would have burst inwards but for the supports I had placed. The strain ceased, and there was more talk. Instantly, for it was no time to hesitate, I grabbed my rifle and ran up the stairs. This time it was not to one of the towers that I went, but to the flat leaded roof itself. Once there, I raced across to the parapet and leaned over, looked down. As I did so, I heard the short, grunted signal and caught the crying of the door under assault. I aimed quickly and fired. From below rose a shrill wail, and the door ceased its groaning. Then, as I took my weight from off the parapet, a huge piece of the coping stone slid from beneath me and fell with a crash among the disorganized throng beneath. Several horrible shrieks quavered through the night air, and I heard a sound of scampering feet. Cautiously, I looked over. In the moonlight, I could see the great coping stone lying across the threshold of the door. I thought I saw something under it. Several things. White. And so a few minutes passed. As I stared, a creature came out from the shadow of the house. It went up to the stone and bent down. When it stood up, it had something in its talons, which it put into its mouth. I loaded my rifle and pulled the trigger. The brute fell to the ground. I made my way down to the study. I was anxious to see how the door had withstood the test of the last assault. Entering, I saw that one of the large props had been displaced, and that the door had been forced inward some 6 inches. There and then, I set to at repairing it with another plank. Then, after pouring myself a little brandy, I returned to the tower to watch. It was now about 3 a.m., and presently the eastern sky began to pale with the coming of dawn. As day came, I scanned the gardens earnestly, but nowhere could I see any sign of the brutes. I leant over and glanced down at the foot of the wall. The body of the thing I had shot the night before was gone. Then I went down onto the roof and looked over from where the coping stone had fallen. Yes, there was the stone, as I had last seen it. But there was no appearance of anything beneath it, nor could I see the creature I had killed. Evidently, the bodies had been taken away. I turned and went down to my study. There I sat down wearily. I was thoroughly tired. A clock chimed the hour of 4. I awoke with a start and looked around. The clock in the corner indicated it was 3 o'clock. It was already afternoon. I must have slept for nearly 11 hours. With a jerky movement, I sat forward in the chair and listened. The house seemed perfectly silent. Slowly I stood up and yawned. Then there was a sudden noise of steps in the corridor. In an instant, I grasped my rifle. Noiselessly, I waited. Had the creatures broken in whilst I slept? Even as I questioned, the steps reached my door, halted momentarily, and then continued along the passage. Silently, I tiptoed to the doorway and peeped out. With relief, I saw my sister. She was going towards the stairs. I was about to call her when it occurred to me that it was very queer she should have crept past my door in that stealthy manner. I was puzzled, but then I remembered her condition of mind on the previous day and decided to follow and see what she was going to do. Quickly, I reached the head of the stairs and paused a moment. Then I heard a sound that sent me leaping down at a mad rate. It was the rattle of bolts being unshot. That foolish sister of mine was actually unbarring the back door. Just as her hand was on the last bolt, I reached her and grabbed her arm. She glanced up quickly, like a frightened animal, and then screamed aloud. "Mary, what's the meaning of this nonsense? Don't tell me that you don't understand the danger." To this, she replied nothing, only trembled violently, gasping and sobbing. Through some minutes, I reasoned with her, pointing out the need for caution and asking her to be brave. I asked her to be sensible and not attempt to leave the house for a few days. At last, I ceased in despair. It was no use talking to her. She was obviously not quite herself for the time being. I told her she had better go to her room. Still, she took no notice, so without more ado I picked her up in my arms and carried her there. At first she screamed wildly, but had relapsed into silent trembling by the time I laid her upon her bed. She was quiet enough, neither speaking nor sobbing, just shaking in a very ague of fear. I took a rug from a chair and spread it over her. I could do nothing more, and so crossed to where Pepper lay in his basket. My sister had nursed him since his wound, and I was pleased to note that in spite of her state of mind, she had looked after the old dog carefully. Stooping, I spoke to him, and he licked my hand. He was too ill to do more. The rest of the day, I spent between the tower and my study. For food, I brought up a loaf from the pantry, and on this and some claret, I lived for that day. What a long, weary day it was. As the evening drew on, I made preparations for spending a second night in the tower, taking up 2 additional rifles and a heavy ulster. After that, I made the round of the house again, paying particular attention to the props on the study door. Then, feeling that I had done all that lay in my power to ensure our safety, I returned to the tower. Slowly the hours passed, without anything unusual happening, and the moon rose, showing the gardens apparently empty and silent. Towards morning, I began to grow stiff and cold with my long vigil. Also, I was uneasy concerning the continued quietness of the creatures. Once or twice, the thought came to me that perhaps they had gone, but in my heart, I found it impossible to believe that it was so. At last, I resolved to take a walk through the house, first calling in at the study for a glass of brandy to warm me. This I did, and while there, I examined the door carefully, but found all as I had left it the night before. The day was just breaking, but it was still dark in the house, and I took one of the study candles with me on my way round. But everything appeared to be in order, and I was on the point of extinguishing my candle when I thought to have another glance around the cellars. It is in the smallest of these places that I keep my wine, close to the cellar stairs, and beyond which I have seldom proceeded. Indeed, save for the rummage around already mentioned, I doubt whether I have ever before been right through the place. I unlocked the door at the top of the stairs and stood and listened. All was silent, save for a faint drip, drip of water. Quietly, I made my way from cellar to cellar. I had but a very dim memory of their arrangement, a succession of cellars, and of one greater than the rest. I moved nervously through them, until I came at last to the great cellar that I remembered. It is reached through a large arch, on which I observed strange, fantastic carvings. It occurred to me how strange it was that I should be so little acquainted with my own house. Yet this may be easily understood when one realizes the size of this ancient pile, and the fact that only my sister and I live in it, occupying few rooms, such as our wants decide. Holding the light high, I walked cautiously about, but so far as the light showed, I saw nothing unusual. About halfway up the cellar, I stubbed my foot against something that gave a metallic sound. Stooping quickly, I saw that I had kicked a large metal ring. I cleared the dust from around it and discovered that it was attached to a trapdoor, black with age. Feeling excited and wondering where it could lead, I put my gun and candle on the floor, took the ring in both hands, and pulled. The trap creaked loudly, and then opened. Propping the edge on my knee, I reached for the candle and held it in the opening, but could see nothing. There were no signs of steps, nothing, save an empty blackness. Then, even as I stared, full of perplexity, I seemed to hear, far down, a faint whisper of sound. I bent my head and listened intently. It may have been my fancy, but I could have sworn to hearing a soft titter that grew into a hideous chuckling, faint and distant. Startled, I let the trap fall with a hollow clang that filled the place with echoes. For a full minute I stood there, quivering, glancing nervously behind and before. But the great cellar was as silent as a grave, and gradually I shook off the frightened sensation. One thing I felt, however, was that the trap ought to be secured. This I accomplished by placing upon it several large pieces of stone which lay by the wall. Then, after a final scrutiny of the rest of the place, I returned to the steps, and so reached the daylight, with an infinite feeling of relief. The sun was now warm and shining brightly, and it was with comparatively light feelings that I made my way up to the tower to survey the gardens. There I found everything quiet, and after a few minutes went down to Mary's room. My sister was sitting on the bed. She seemed quite herself again, and made no attempt to move away as I approached her. Yet I observed that she scanned my face anxiously, as though in doubt and but half assured that there was nothing to fear from me. To my questions as to how she felt, she replied that she was hungry and would like to go down to prepare breakfast. I told her she might go on condition that she did not meddle with any of the outer doors. At my mention of the doors, a sudden look of fright crossed her face, but she said nothing, and then left the room. Crossing the floor, I approached Pepper. He had wakened as I entered, but beyond a slight yelp of pleasure and a soft rapping with his tail, had kept quiet. I was greatly delighted with this improvement, and after a while went down to my study. In a little time, Mary appeared, carrying a tray on which smoked a hot breakfast. As she entered the room, I saw her gaze fasten on the props that supported the study door. Her lips tightened. "Come, Mary," I said. "Cheer up. Things look brighter. I've seen none of the creatures since yesterday morning." She looked at me in a curiously puzzled manner, and then fear swept into her eyes. But she said nothing beyond an unintelligible murmur of acquiescence. Breakfast over, I returned to the tower. Here, during the greater part of the day, I maintained a strict watch over the gardens. Once or twice I went down to see how my sister was getting along, but I refrained from discussing my vigil. It was evident that any reference to the swine things was more than her shaken nerves could bear. That night I slept in a bed, the first time for 2 nights. In the morning I rose early and took a walk through the house. All was as it should be, and I went up to the tower to have a look at the garden. Here again I found perfect quietness. At breakfast I was greatly pleased to see that Mary seemed to have recovered. She talked sensibly and quietly, only keeping carefully from any mention of the last couple of days. During the day I kept on the alert, spending much of my time in the tower. It would soon be 3 days since I had seen any of the things, but still I intended to use utmost caution. For all that I could tell, this protracted silence might be a ruse to tempt me from the house, perhaps right into their arms. I made no attempt to leave. On the 6th day, I had the pleasure of seeing Pepper once more upon his feet, and though still weak, he managed to keep me company for the whole of the day. How slowly the time went, and never a thing to indicate that any of the brutes still infested the gardens. It was on the 9th day that, finally, I decided to run the risk, if any there were, and sally out. With this purpose in view, I loaded one of the shotguns. Then, after making a careful scrutiny of the grounds from the tower, I called Pepper to follow me, and made my way outside. Pepper ran ahead, sniffing as he went. At times he stopped to investigate, a bullet hole in the pathway, or a piece of torn sod. I observed him critically as he went along, and could discover nothing of uneasiness in his demeanour. By this I was assured that the gardens were empty, at least for the present, of those hateful things. Reaching the place where I had shot the first creature, I made a careful scrutiny, but could see nothing. From there I went on to where the great coping stone had fallen. It lay on its side, half in and half out of the ground. I looked at it closely. I had seen several of the brutes struck down beneath it, and now not a vestige of them was to be seen, not even a blood stain. I felt puzzled as I turned the matter over in my mind, but I could think of no plausible explanation, and after looking around the surrounding gardens, I set off for the pit. On the way, I kept a sharp outlook, holding my gun in readiness. But Pepper was running ahead, I noticed, without any apparent hesitation. From this I augured that there was no imminent danger to be apprehended, and I followed quickly in his wake. He had reached the top of the pit now, and was nosing his way along the edge. A minute later I was beside him, looking down into the pit. For a moment I could scarcely believe that it was the same place, so greatly was it changed. The dark, wooded ravine of a fortnight ago, with a foliage-hidden stream at the bottom, no longer existed. Instead, my eyes showed me a ragged chasm, partly filled with a gloomy lake of turbid water. A little to my left, the side of the pit appeared to have collapsed altogether, forming a deep V-shaped cleft in the cliff. This rift ran from the upper edge of the ravine nearly down to the water, and penetrated into the pit side to a distance of some 40 feet. But what attracted my attention, more than even the stupendous split itself, was a great hole right in the angle of the V. It was not unlike an arched doorway. My first impression that there had been a landslip was, I began to see, not sufficient to account for all the changes I witnessed. And the water. I turned suddenly, for I could hear the noise of running water. I could see nothing, but it seemed to come from somewhere at the east end of the pit. Slowly, I made my way in that direction, the sound growing plainer, until I stood right above it. Thrusting my head over the cliff, I saw below me a torrent of water issuing from a fissure in the pit side into the lake beneath. A little further along, I saw several others. These, then, would help to account for the water in the pit, especially if the fall of rock had blocked the outlet to the stream. Yet I puzzled my head to account for the generally shaken appearance of the place, that huge cleft further up the ravine. I could imagine an earthquake or a great explosion creating such conditions, but of these there had been neither. Slowly, and keeping a careful watch in all directions, I made a circuit of the pit, but found little else that I had not already seen. For a while longer I loitered about, keeping my eyes and ears open, but still without seeing or hearing anything suspicious. All this while, Pepper had shown no signs of uneasiness. So far as I could see, his attention had been taken with sniffing among the grass at the edge of the pit. At times he would leave the edge and run along towards the house as though following invisible tracks, but in all cases returning after a few minutes. I had but little doubt that he was tracing out the footsteps of the swine things, and the fact that each one seemed to lead him back to the pit appeared to me proof that the brutes had all returned to whence they came.